Robert Pollack is a professor of biological sciences at Columbia University and director of the Center for the Study of Science and Religion. He is the author of The Missing Moment, Signs of Life, and The Faith of Biology and the Biology of Faith. I interviewed him at Columbia University. Okay, well, first of all, thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Pleasure.
I've been reading your latest book, The Faith of Biology and the Biology of Faith, and early on in it you allude to a kind of transformation that you underwent. You say that at one point you held the view that many of your scientific colleagues hold, basically, of the world, which is that, as you put it, the world has no intrinsic meaning or purpose. We are mortal. We wish it were not so. It is. Kind of a bleak view. You've since changed your mind, I gather. How would you describe your current view of the world?
No, I don't think I changed my mind about the world. I think I changed my mind about how I want to live in the world. I think, in fact, my choice to become active in the rituals and in the community of my ancestral religion, which is Judaism, was a choice driven by a closer appreciation of the facts of the world as I understood them through the data on natural selection in particular. It is the meaninglessness and purposelessness and absence of directionality and absence of perfectibility in the mechanisms of natural selection which I find, frankly, unbearable on the face of it. And so I felt freed by my free will choice to behave irrationally and to accept the religion of my ancestors in addition to the data, not in place of it, but rather because of it.
Okay. So now you believe in, as you put it, a caring God.
Yeah.
Okay. Now what's interesting to me, one thing that's interesting to me is that you're a scientist.
Yes.
I've talked to a number of scientists who believe in God. Usually, although I haven't found any who believe you can prove the existence of God by reference to the physical universe, usually they, first of all, want to stress that the physical universe is consistent with the idea of a God. And more than that, most of them look for at least some corroborating evidence for the thesis that God exists. You are almost defiant in your insistence that search is in vain. I've got some, we must accept the meaninglessness, this is the way you put it, we must accept the meaninglessness and purposelessness of our presence on earth as the verdict of testable science. Natural selection seems quite free of design, purpose, or direction, and so on. It is unusual, right? It seems, most scientists are almost obsessed with the idea of evidence and the idea that all their beliefs are consistent with the evidence. You almost like to have it the opposite way.
Well, let's see, Robert. That's a stack of questions which can be entered at any point. So let me enter it at the last question. To be obsessed with or to validate evidence of experimentation above all opinion is the presumption of science. It is the motivating drive that generates this great machine for understanding nature. And to carry it forward properly, one must accept boundaries on it. The major boundary on it is the presumptive existence of questions which cannot be answered by this machine because they do not form testable hypotheses. It's my understanding as a scientist that your question has no testable form.
My question being?
Whether or not the universe is compatible in data with the existence of a caring God. It's not a testable question. It's an affirmable belief, which I share, but it is not a belief driven by data, unless one says that the feelings one has inside oneself are data. That is what I believe to be the case, but those kind of data are not testable by examination of the universe. Those kind of data are, if they're testable at all, testable by examination of mental states.
Okay, the belief in God, I'd agree, is very rarely driven by data. But that's quite different from saying that one can't look in the physical world for evidence corroborating.
Oh, of course you can look.
Well, but you insist further. But you insist it's in some sense pointless, or you find only You find no evidence of meaning or purpose in the physical world.
Now, wait, I didn't say that. What I said was, in that part of the physical world of which we're made,
Right.
in that part of the mechanism that drives the creation of new forms of life over time, natural selection, it is, to the best of my ability, driven by the selectable level of error production in the replication of DNA molecules, driving variation from individual to individual within a breeding population. There is no prior understanding necessary of which variant will survive for some variants to survive. I no more can see how our presence, for instance, drives the argument that we were designed to be than that I could understand an antibiotic-resistant bacterium is driven by the intelligent wish that some caring God created. Natural selection is creative, but it is not designed. In that difference lies my inability to understand how data can possibly provide me with a purpose or a meaning or a hope for the future in the largest sense.
Well, you're saying that natural selection is not a product of design? It was not designed?
Correct. Well, I'm saying that the data of it are consistent with the absence of design.
Well, are they equally consistent with the thesis of design?
Not to my understanding.
Okay, but wait, you believe in a creator God, right? The God of Judaism is a creator God.
Yes.
Now, we know that the immediate mechanism of the creation of the human species was natural selection.
Yes.
Now, if we are a product of a creative God, and natural selection is the immediate mechanism of our creation, it seems to me hard to imagine how natural selection could be anything other than the instrument of divine creation. Where am I confused here?
As you're reading to me from my book, and you have it and I don't, I'm at a slight disadvantage.
Well, you did write it, I guess.
I will try and quote from myself. This is a good question and a troublesome question. And I went to one of my teachers, Rabbi Dean Steinsaltz, with this question, as I went with many of the questions in this book. And his answer, which was in his typical way very gnomic, was to say, well, God says to the angels, make me a species that can choose to say thanks. I don't care how. And then, over a period in time of 15 billion years, of which 4 billion or 5 are available for natural selection on this planet, we emerge with the capacity to choose whether or not to say thanks for our existence. And what is asked for by the Creator God in the caring way of that God's expectations is that we choose to say thanks. Okay. But to have the choice requires a brain capable of consciousness, memory, repression, all those things our brains are capable of. To say that the system was set up intentionally is a data-free hypothesis. To say that we come out of it with the capacity to say thanks or not is a provable hypothesis.
Well, wait, but first of all, to say that the system is set up to create us is part of the scenario you just laid out.
No, I said that is a matter of my belief. It's
right.
Not testable.
Okay, well, but let's talk about that a little. I mean, if you assert that, I mean, if one person asserts that natural selection was not designed to create intelligent, reflective life, and another person asserts that natural selection was designed to create intelligent life, I can imagine data that would prove either point of view, but that would favor one point of view or the other. And here's an example. People can argue about if natural selection on the one hand seems as if it was very likely to create intelligent life eventually, which is the view of some people like Edward O. Wilson, or on the other hand, if it, and this is the view of Stephen Jay Gould, that it was really a fluke, that natural selection was very unlikely to create intelligent life. I mean, that argument is relevant to the question of whether it's a product of design. If it's a product of design, presumably it is a process that's likely to create intelligent life.
What you said may be so, but it has nothing to do with experimental science. The opinion of Wilson, the opinion of Gould, the opinion of Pollack, and your opinion are irrelevant. What is necessary is the conversion of an opinion to a disprovable hypothesis.
Okay, fine, but there are data that are more consistent with one of these.
No, data more or less consistent is not experimental tests. It's not. To say, for instance, that evolution is improbable requires the question of improbable compared to what?
Well, no, wait. First of all, evolutionary biology, Darwinism, by virtue of being an historical science, is simply not a laboratory science only. Not all of the hypotheses, not all of Darwin's falsifiable hypotheses come in the form of things you can do in a laboratory. But still, there's evidence for and there's evidence against, and some sciences are like that. And let me give you an example. I mean, the question of how likely was the evolution of intelligent life, okay?
It's an irrelevant question.
Well, wait.
Which question do you want to discuss?
I thought you'd agreed it's a relevant question, and your view is just that there's no data bearing on it.
No, I'll state, just because I am not clear any longer where we are, let me try and state where I think I am. I am not able to wait to stake my beliefs on data, nor do I see any need to do so. Therefore, the question of data is interesting to me only in an intellectual sense. But my religious beliefs are important to me in an emotional as well as intellectual sense, and those emotional needs don't wait for data. So I don't understand the harping on data.
Well, that's all fine if your view is just, I don't want to look at the data. But
no, it's that I don't need to look at the data.
If your view is, I personally don't need to look at the data, right, that's fine too. But there's the further question of whether data are or are not logically germane to the question. And what is your view on that?
Fair, fine. My view on that is that to the extent I am capable of understanding the data as I read them, the data that say the only structure carrying information which persists through time longer than the life of an individual is the information contained in the sequence of bases in DNA. That data, and the data that flow from it, are consistent in my mind with the simplest model being that errors in the replication of that information drive variation of phenotype. Variation of phenotype is selectable for survival of progeny. Out of that come everything alive without design.
Well, everyone agrees on that. I mean, not everyone, but
most
biologists agree on that.
I would say, therefore, most biologists have no religious convictions, having seen that to be the case. Or if they do, they, like me, dissociate their religious convictions from the data, because those data, for instance, preclude, to my mind, any simple way the species perfects itself, or any simple way any individual in it is the paradigm of perfectibility or perfection. These are serious religious problems. Well, if one waits for the data to
well, now you're
confirm.
talking about a very specific conception of God, where I guess perfection or perfectibility would have to figure in. But if we're talking about the more generic question of whether natural selection could be the process of design, then it seems to me that, one relevant question is, how likely was the process to create intelligent life in the first place? In which case, there are relevant data. For example, you can ask this question: how many times did multicellular life evolve independently? The more times it evolved, the more likely you were to get multicellular life eventually, one way or another. As it happens, multicellular life evolved independently a number of times. Those kinds of data, it seems to me, are relevant to the question of direction in evolution, which itself is relevant to the question of whether evolution is possibly the product of design, whether it was set in motion to do something.
I'm not sure why you're asking me this question, but since you're asking me this question, I will say that to the best of my professional judgment, the data you quote are irrelevant to your question, or I'm missing something. I cannot see the connection.
Okay. I guess if you ask why I seem to be harping on this, it's quotes like this from your book. Our species is not the creation of design, but the result of accumulated errors. As if those two were logically incompatible, and they're just not. It could be that the immediate mechanism of design involves the accumulation of errors, but that the process is likely to lead to certain kinds of outcomes, therefore has direction, and may be the product of design.
You're making the following presumptions, which I would consider presumptions of faith and not science. Okay? You're making an if-then statement. You're saying, if a creator God initiates the universe, as would be consistent with any model of an initial point in time and space out of which the universe emerges. Then the really interesting religious questions all obtain about a place which is neither in physical space nor physical time and precedes both and follows both, in which the historical reality in which life is embedded, the four-dimensional web of space and time in which life evolves, is itself the middle piece of a sandwich, separated on both sides by a timeless, spaceless, universal, meaningless in language place of God. And that my religion says, and many other religions say in one or another way, this physical reality sits between a timeless state before, during, and afterward in which a creator God works. But the creator God's work plays out in a fabric of space and time, which is the creation, not the creator. In that context, it does not follow to me, as it follows to you, that if that were so, then we would find evidence of it in this four-dimensional web. The evidence you're looking for is evidence outside of space and time. I don't look for it. I accept as my faith that that creator God existed before the creation, hence the beginning of the 5 books of Moses. And I accept as a totally data-free belief that there will be a time when this experiment is over and some aspect of myself and of you will survive in a timeless state.
Okay, but
that's a religious statement. I do not believe anything I've said of my faith converts to data in this physical world at all. So strong disagreement with you.
yeah, I certainly don't believe you can get to firm religious belief through the data.
Okay.
I certainly don't think you can.
So we agree.
No, but I think you can get closer or further away.
Fine, fair enough. Fair enough.
Now,
I guess you may be right. I'm not interested in that.
Yeah. Oh. Okay. Well, I'll take that as the closest thing I've ever had to a concession and move on. In describing this religious experience, which is your own religious insight, which is what you're basing your this whole set of beliefs on, you describe it as an unbidden, spontaneous, strong inward feeling, and you describe it as frankly irrational. Can you say any more about what? I mean, you've had the feeling apparently. Well, what is it like for those of us who are forced to just sit there and ponder the data?
Oh, I am at risk of elevating something small to something big. It's not a, how can I say? Let's say, nothing I am about to say requires more than that I am a person susceptible to wide emotional swings. And my interpretation of these emotional swings I take to be something I can be grateful for. That's it. So that I may find myself going from a sense of hopelessness to a sense of reassurance. I choose to say that I am apprehending what is intended for me at those moments. I cannot prove to you that it's so. But that comfort that comes from that sense of being able to apprehend an intention is the experience. It's the comfort. It's the relief. Now, I will say that in a godless way. The burden of a scientist is to think that he or she may have the ability to understand everything. I cannot carry the burden of understanding everything any longer. The burden of claiming to understand everything requires minimally to meet the claim that one can understand one's own end. And it seems to me an intrinsic incomprehensibility. As intrinsically incomprehensible to contemplate my end as it is to contemplate a creator God existing before time and space. The words form sentences, but the underlying meaning retreats in both cases. Now, therefore, I must talk in terms that sound rational about what I acknowledge up front cannot be encompassed by rationality in that I'm not sure I could ever show you what I mean. It doesn't transfer to pre-existent experience in either case.
Okay.
That's the best I can do. In other words, I experience things which I do not have vocabulary for, but I have physical and emotional sensation of.
Okay.
And I choose not to say of them that they are passing fancies which I'd best be done with because I can't work under those circumstances as a scientist.
Okay.
I choose rather to say that they're also a form of data that I best pay attention to.
Okay. I assume you'll consider it a hopelessly crude oversimplification to say that you believe in God because it feels good.
I would presume that that would be a hopelessly simple-minded simplification because I believe in God whether it feels good or not. That's the burden.
Is that right?
Yeah.
But don't you talk about a kind of, let me quote from your own work. You found the vision of the world implied by the theory of natural selection, as you view it at least, too terrifying and depressing to me to be born without the emotional buffer of my own religion.
Which is that these data, though on the face of it are the ones we spoke about, nevertheless are there as the result of the intentions of a God, which is a notion of being cared for despite the data. So, what do you make of that? What do you make of that?
I don't know.
It's not science, but it's not fake, so it's data. It's data of me. I'm confronted with the data of me, and I don't know what else to do about it, but first to describe it, and second to try and understand it.
Okay. The in your earlier book, The Missing Moment,
Mm-hmm.
you made some comparisons between the religious experience, the experience of religious insight, and the experience of scientific insight.
Right.
What are some of the similarities?
Well, the main experience of scientific insight and religious insight, as I have experienced them, and God knows, interesting phrase in this context, yes. I claim no generality of knowledge here. I work from a data set of me. I have had the luck, the gift, the circumstance of seeing things in nature a couple of times, and many more times of being present when something is seen. By seen, I mean at once a fog lifts and things are clear, and it is extremely difficult to recreate the sense of the fog once the clarity sets in. The most spectacular example of this I saw was a meeting at Cold Spring Harbor some 30 years ago at which David Baltimore, Howard Temin, and others came and spoke about work on viruses that seemed to go through a DNA intermediate state even though their genomes were RNA. And the paradox was lifted by Baltimore and by Temin in showing that there was an enzyme made by this virus that converted RNA to DNA. Instantaneously, a room of 400 people understood that messengers from genes could now be made into genes, and that therefore, in principle, one could direct evolution, that one could experiment with germlines, that one could play with DNA through what it expresses, one could do all sorts of things otherwise not thought about, because the dogma of the time was that DNA was an archival body of information that could be read out but never read in.
Right.
And here was an enzyme that read into DNA. A room of 400 people underwent a totally discontinuous transformation of understanding of the natural world in their profession.
Mm-hmm.
Discontinuously. I consider that discontinuity of insight to be like the discontinuity of insight that I have read about, not experienced, but read about. One reads about it in the Bible. The classic case, I would say, is Moses walks along and there's a bush burning and he says to himself, I must stop and look at that bush.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why must he stop and look at that bush? I mean, that sense of looking and then noticing the bush is burning and not being consumed is, to me, a statement of timelessness. How is a bush burning and not being consumed? Because time has stopped.
And isn't there also the similarity between religious and scientific insight, that scientific insight actually is not necessarily in a very precise way data-driven? I mean, people leap to hypotheses that seem consistent with the data, but may develop a conviction in the hypothesis that in effect is irrational, and they may have a lot of trouble letting go of it.
Let's turn the thing on its head. I would say there are three different current ways of understanding experimental science. The classic way is that a person accumulates information about nature sufficient to build a hypothesis and then creates a test of the hypothesis. The second is that a person accumulates out of imagination a hypothesis and then goes about finding out a way to test it. And the third is that a person accumulates in their head out of curiosity a hypothesis which is untestable, but calls it science. John Horgan calls the lattermost ironic science.
Right.
String theory, which can't be tested without a super collider the size of the planet, is ironic because the people creating the theory know it can't be tested. So I would consider that real science lies in that middle place. My experience of real science is you're bothered by a question you have. The question you have is not, how do I arrange this data, but is this insight of mine really so, or am I just being clever? The beginning of a loop of science can be entered at any point. It can be entered at the data gathering point, or at the testing point, or at the rearrangement of the hypothesis based on the data point. My experience is new science begins with the idea, and the moment of the idea is revelatory. It's a discontinuity. You look at what you know, you've lived with it for 6 or 10 years, you say, wait a minute, if I think of it this way, it all comes out different.
Mm-hmm.
That wait a minute is as discontinuous as religion.
And it's a kind of epiphany.
It's completely the same in my experience.
And in your experience, literally, I mean, the kind
Yes.
of religious kind
Yes.
of conversion, you could
Yes.
say, was in a sense an epiphany.
Yeah.
That this makes sense of the world not in an empirical
Correct.
sense.
And
but-
then you say to yourself, well, let's go about and see how this works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, in science, you go about seeing how this works by designing testable models, testable experiments, seeking the best model for the test.
Right.
And that's what scientific aesthetics and scientific taste come in finding the simplest, cleanest way to test something bravely so that if you're wrong, you know it fast.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of going through the motions of experimentation but never really pushing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of a religious experience, a similar bravery is just the opposite. It's to give up the need for proving it and see how it feels to live inside the experience of not understanding, which for scientists is very radical.
Mm-hmm.
But I accept the burden of not understanding something.
Yeah, you talk about this, the distinction between the knowable and the unknowable. I mean, in science, I gather as a scientist, you used to think about the distinction between the known and the unknown, and you push the frontier, and then more is known and less is unknown. At some point, you came to realize that that you could also think about the unknowable. The front is a place where the frontier would never be pushed kind of into.
Right. And I think I said in the book, I hoped I said in the book very clearly, that by definition the notion of unknowable is untestable. So that you can either accept as a matter of scientific faith that there is nothing unknowable, mm-hmm. or you accept as a matter of other faith that there is something unknowable. But in neither case will you prove it. Now, excuse me, let me say, before you ask me another question, colleagues here, in particular in the philosophy department, have been very strict with me on the illogic of this position, because it's easy to demonstrate unknowability in a trivial way. You don't know the path of every molecule of oxygen in this room.
Right.
I mean, God may know in some algorithmic way based on quantum mechanics and thermodynamics, but you don't know and never will know the smoke trail that will be made if you light a match. So what? My argument is precisely that the things you don't know that matter to you are important, despite the fact that there are many things you don't know that don't matter to you.
Can you even say what kinds of things we'll never know, or is even that unknown?
No, that's a fair question. I can say that's a very good question. An iron rule of science is that people who make predictions about what will happen are always too conservative. I mean, if you really want to laugh, look at a 1950 movie about what will be so in 2000, and it looks like 1955, not 2000. So I'm in perilous ground to say what won't be known. But I think I'm comfortable to say that what won't be known from data is why it is necessary to act altruistically in a way that does not preserve one's genes. I don't think it will be known in DNA-driven biological causative terms why people act against their self-interest. That would be an answer. In other words, I don't think it will be. I don't think real love will be reduced to data. I don't think so.
Do you think we actually, I mean, I think we have an explanation of why people are capable of love and why, how love entered our lineage.
100%. Because, look, I mean,
and
any species that follows the the natural selective path of a small number of progeny cared for has to have built in the capacity for caring, otherwise that species crashes. I mean, one presumes that mayflies don't love their offspring, but one presumes that gorillas, as people, love their offspring. However, as the Greeks pointed out, love has many meanings. Agape is not eros, is not philia.
Right.
And I'm talking about agape. I'm talking about selfless love that does not benefit the self, puts the self at risk, and does not benefit the germline either. And let me give you a concrete example of it, okay? I think the origins of medicine are agape. The idea that you must care for a stranger's health is a religious idea in all cultures, initially. The tragedy of this country is it's become a business, and a great piece of good medicine is lost intrinsically as charity goes out the window and is replaced by business considerations. But the origins of hospital, hospice, and hotel are all the same. They are places inside a church ground.
I mean, it seems to me on the question of love, we know how love entered the lineage, and as for people applying it to people other than their immediate offspring and kin and so on, you know, the world is very complex, very different from the world we evolved in. The bonding mechanisms that attach you to your own offspring are themselves not entirely known, and so on. It seems to me that you know, it's reasonable to believe that this is what you're talking about is what in Darwinian terms you might call a misdirection of love in a functional Darwinian sense, although it's a very laudable, in a moral sense, a very laudable direction.
Laudable by whom?
Well, laudable by people who share probably the values that you and I have.
Okay, so what's the point of laudability?
I don't know, but it's a word.
The point of laudability, like the point of doing the right thing, is that it's not subject to experimental verification or validation. It's something you feel.
It's a value.
Okay.
Well,
so you have just popped out with an example of having an irrational, indefensible, undefinable, unjustifiable feeling that something is right.
Well, we could argue about whether it's justifiable. I mean, some philosophers believe you can justify moral values, some believe you don't, and that's probably beyond the scope but of this conversation. Except that, I was asking for examples of what's unknowable in a scientific sense.
Okay.
Is that an example?
I would say an example would be, yes, the impulse of loving something that you cannot know is the impulse of loving. I'm stuck for words. I actually relearned the word agape from a small book by Sir John Templeton, no other, in which he attempts to find the agape structure inside the formal theologies of many religions, and does so, and argues that this is a universal substrate of religious experience, an insight I think worth actually pursuing. And although he doesn't say it as such, I would say that what's interesting about his discovery of its generality is my presumption of its non-demonstrability through data. It's anti-selective. So the appearance universally of an anti-natural selective behavior is an argument for an emergent use of free will against biology.
But it could be selective in cultural evolution. That is to say, with Christians loving each other, or at least behaving somewhat charitably toward each other, sustained the body of Christianity as a body of, memes, you might say, in cultural evolution.
No worse horror of meaninglessness than the trap of memes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Now, memes, this is a word Richard Dawkins coined. It refers to viewing ideas as, in a sense, active agents that infiltrate your brain, and the ones that are most conducive to their own replication, by definition, replicate the best. And it's a view of a brain as a kind of a more passive agent than we commonly think of. Go ahead.
It is a rhetorician's argument to gut meaning from language. It is a self-reflective argument that assures that whatever you feel most strongly about is a demonstration of its meaninglessness. And I have no way through this trap except to reject it irrationally.
I mean, specifically, the one context for this discussion is that...
let me say, I think Dawkins is not only brilliant in this, but he provides any thinking person with the opportunity to have a religious crisis if they take him seriously. A serious person following Dawkins's logic to completion is left with no meaning to anything important. The importance to that person of their idea is a demonstration of its mean-like parasitic qualities.
Right. I mean, specifically, Richard Dawkins has suggested that belief in God can be thought of as a virus, as a parasite upon your brain. It's not a true belief. It's just a belief that's good at replicating itself. It may even be bad for you, which is what the word virus implies, which is why I think the word virus is actually wrong, because religious belief is very often good for the individuals who hold it, I think, demonstrably. Not always, but often. But how do you handle this idea that religion may be a mere pathology? You take it seriously, clearly.
Absolutely.
It's not. You don't think it's facile so much, right? As depressing.
I think it is what happens. It is what happens when you make your filter for discussion so monochromatic as to allow in only the argument and not the feelings that append to it. If you allow in the feelings that append to it, you see how Dawkins is enjoying the cruelty of his argument. And you allow yourself the visceral reaction that such a cruel person need not be attended to.
Well, but surely you don't think the cruelty of a person has direct bearing on whether what they're saying is right or wrong.
I think I am free
we now know that Albert Einstein was mean to his wife,
I don't believe in a world devoid of meaning. I suspect Richard Dawkins does not believe either in a world devoid of meaning. He cares too much for his own reputation for that to be the case.
Well, he claims that the universe is purposeless.
That's different from what I'm saying.
Okay.
I don't think he would claim his writings are purposeless. But you could claim that Dawkins's books are good examples of very powerful memes, and that Dawkins is taken over by the virus called the meme, and it has taken over his reputation, made of him it, and he has disappeared into it by this discussion. We're not talking about Dawkins. We're talking about a thing that emerged from Dawkins, which is occupying us right now. I think it is a religious statement that the rabbi said to me in the beginning, which I quoted, which says that the Creator God wishes to be thanked by choice. No choice, no thanks, no purpose. I accept as a basic tenet of my faith, I must be free to make a choice in order to have a purpose, in order to be inside my religion. The world of memes deprives me of that choice and makes me the passive carrier of things that have their own Darwinian purposes. It is the profound triumph of Darwinian natural selection in the world of ideas that ends the possibility of real, irrational, free will choice against Darwinian purpose. And the Darwinian purpose is simply meaningless. It's survival of something. I'm not interested in being part of a mechanism in which something survives, but toward no end but its own survival. Dawkins, in other words, is to my mind very powerfully disturbing. He is the creator of what I think to be a serious new religion of science. It is a religion of science in that it diminishes human beings to carriers. It is a triumph of Darwin over people.
And you reject his worldview in some sense because it is disturbing, and because by rejecting it you affirm your own free will.
To do so. Exactly right. The one thing left to me is to ignore that. Now, it is not smart to do that. It is not intellectually grounded.
I mean, look,
to do
you
that.
said yourself it feels better to reject the meme worldview than to accept it. You find accepting it very disturbing. So why can't I say that the rejection of the mimetic worldview is itself just a meme that's very good at replicating itself because it makes you feel good?
You can. And at the end of this, there's no God.
So don't go that route.
No, but that this is what makes religion so difficult to talk about as a scientist. These things are valuable conversations, but they will not stop me from praying tomorrow morning. And when I pray, I will not have proof that I'm not wasting my time. But I will bet that way. And in so doing, if Dawkins says I'm following another kind of mimetic trap, so be it. I don't feel that way. I accept the threat that the failure to feel that way is the victory of that meme, but I'll bet this way. And I'll bet this way partly because I want to, and partly because as a mortal being, I have a certain irreducible regard and respect for my ancestors and for other people's ancestors who have held to these irrational beliefs. I feel some obligation not to drop that ball.
So it's to some extent an act of cultural fidelity.
Correct.
Okay.
I think it has to be, Robert, because a religion of one is not a religion. I think all religions grow as social. I mean, they are. If they emerge mimetically, they emerge from societies. They don't. They are stimulated by individual revelation. But religious structures that last through time are cultural artifacts that last by shared teaching parentage, by vertical transmission as well as horizontal transmission. And so I'm the recipient of all of those. Look, I guess another way to put it is, as we are all in our genomes the carriers of thousands of dead sequences that get into the germline and therefore must be replicated in our species, so also probably culturally we're the transmitters of thousands of dead ideas that we're stuck with. And it's my bet that this idea is not dead. That's the only difference I have with Dawkins.
The idea of religion.
Yeah, the mechanism of transmission I'll accept. As I accept the mechanism of transmission through natural selection of DNA gets me here, I accept that mechanism of transmission of ideas gets my religion here. In both cases, what I reject is the meaninglessness implied by the mechanism being the sufficient explanation of its purpose. Mechanism is not purpose, is my faith.
No, I think I agree with you. But I would say if the mechanism, well, anyway, we had that argument. We had it for a long time, too. You talk about, you kind of get at the problem of evil a little in your book when you talk about, in your view, in your view, the unavoidability of randomness of accidents, and for that matter, evil. I mean, you have a way of thinking about that. What is it?
Well, first it is to say and affirm that evil exists. There is a kind of religious position which says that evil is a matter of opinion, but I believe that one cannot stake an asymmetric position of belief in a caring God, confront the theodicy problem of evil in such a universe, and walk away from it. It's a deep problem. If this creator God is capable of carrying out this God's wishes, why would those wishes include evil? That is the problem of theodicy.
Right.
And I'm not about to stake out an answer to something that has preoccupied thinkers east and west for millennia, but my current way of dealing with it is to say that at least part of an explanation for the persistence of evil is that it is the necessary, it's the toxic waste of free will. If you have the freedom to choose correctly or well, then you have the freedom to choose incorrectly or poorly. And in that freedom to choose poorly runs into a freedom to choose evilly, to choose gratuitously to cause pain, hurt, and death. And it is, in fact, inside this notion of purpose in creation to say that without that risk, there is only the boring reality of angels. That is, individuals who are extensions of God's will in a trivial and linear way and can only do good. Such a world may be present outside of time and space in some notion of heaven, but it is not here on earth.
Speaking of heaven,
yes,
is heaven is an afterlife part of Judaic belief or not? It's
well, yes and no for a straight answer. My colleague at Jewish Theological Seminary of America, Neil Gilman, has written a book recently called The Death of Death, Jewish Theology of an Afterlife. And this religion is a religion of actions as much or more than it is a religion of stated and required beliefs. And so I think a fair position, which I crudely represent as having learned from the great physician Maimonides 800 years ago would be that as we can't know, we cannot therefore make many statements about it. But I think it is a tenet of Jewish faith that there will be a time, after time, when some aspect of each individual will be restored to a timeless state with God as those states were before creation. There is, in other words, if you like, a really heavy religious idea that before creation, Torah existed. Laws, texts, expectations, right and wrong, obligations, all existed and will exist afterwards. And in this time and space, our obligation to learn to follow them is an obligation to place what is left of us after death in a state capable of coexisting once again. Otherwise, we fall out of the experiment. Okay. Now, that's not the Christian heaven in which it is not a place of saints and of angels and of immediate accessibility. This end of days follows a perfection of the universe, a perfection of the planet, a perfection of the species, which, as I said to you, is incompatible with everything I understand about the data. So, speaking now as a Jew and not as a scientist, my biggest religious problem is bringing together the religious hope and expectation of perfectibility of everything real, so that the end of days may come, with the impossibility of doing that by any natural means given the origins of natural selection. That's a problem for me as a Jew. But I live inside the faith that that problem is not understandable to me, but will be understood one day.
Okay. Now,
tough question. Go ahead.
Now, heaven, in certainly the Christian heaven, I think is thought of as, among other things, a very powerful incentive. I mean, you're supposed to act good to get there. What is your view on the extent to which religious belief is a prerequisite for good behavior?
That's a great question. It is a way to become a good person. It is not the way. And certainly to say that there is a religion which is better than another is as data-free as to say there's one language which is better than another. There are more and less complicated languages and more or less sibilant languages, and there are more or less complicated and sibilant religions. But I'm not bothered by the existence of a multiplicity of religions. And I believe that it is the obligation of a serious religious person to, having accepted the mystery of his or her own religion, to seek to understand what is the mystery of another religion. Mm-hmm. To seek to find the commonality in what is irrationally held to, and to respect it for the burden of irrationality as is felt by someone of another religion in their beliefs.
And do you think religious belief of some kind, at least, is a prerequisite for living a life of true meaning?
That's a great question. I have found it so for me. I have found it so for me, but I cannot claim it to be so for anyone else. I have seen, however, that what it has served for me is to protect me from the temptation of placing myself, as Rabbi Steinsaltz says, on the throne of God. And I do know some people for whom there is no throne of God and no one on it. And those people are good people. But I know many people claiming there is no one on the throne of God who place themselves on it. And that's a disaster. So, if nothing else, this religious conviction has given me some modesty and some awe and some capacity not to claim powers I don't actually have.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll leave it there.
Good.
Thanks very much.
Good. Well, thank you for this opportunity to be slightly concerned and confused and disturbed by your question.
Oh, I take that as the highest compliment.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.